The old clock on the living room wall ticked like a slow heartbeat, each second echoing through the hollow house that had long forgotten laughter. Margaret Hill sat in her worn armchair, her fingers wrapped tightly around a cold cup of tea. The steam had faded hours ago, much like the warmth in her life. Outside, the world carried on. Cars hummed, children shouted, and neighbors went about their busy lives. But inside this small house, time seemed frozen. Every night, Margaret stared at the same object, the black rotary phone sitting on the wooden table beside her. It hadn't rung in years, yet she couldn't bear to move it. It stood there like a silent witness, guarding decades of waiting. Each night she whispered to herself, maybe tonight her son would remember her. Maybe tonight he would call. The house smelled faintly of lavender and dust. The walls were lined with framed photographs. A younger Margaret smiling beside a tall man with kind eyes, and a small boy with golden hair and a shy grin. Her husband, Thomas, and their only son, Daniel. She looked at those photos now and felt a painful mixture of love and regret. There had been a time when the sound of laughter filled this home, when Daniel ran down the hallway with a toy airplane, when Thomas teased her for burning the toast. But time, she learned, doesn't just pass, it takes things from you. It steals moments, erases voices, and replaces them with silence. It had been 20 years since she last heard Daniel's voice. He was just 16 when he left. After a storm of words neither of them meant but could never take back, Margaret had begged him to stay. Thomas had stood quietly, his face expressionless. And then the door closed and her son never returned. The first few months were unbearable. Every knock on the door made her heart leap. Every phone ring sent her rushing to answer, but the call she hoped for never came. Eventually, even hope learned to be quiet. Margaret's neighbors had long stopped visiting. They whispered about her, the woman who waits for ghosts. She didn't mind. They hadn't seen what she'd seen. Her son's laughter, his eyes that mirrored her own, his little hand clutching hers when he was scared of the thunder. How could anyone move on from that? One night, as rain tapped against the windows, Margaret found herself talking aloud, not to anyone, but to the air itself. "Do you still remember me, Daniel?" she murmured. "Do you ever wonder if I'm still here waiting?" Her voice broke halfway through the sentence. She pressed her hands together, trembling, and closed her eyes. Somewhere in her chest, anger fought with sorrow. She had been a good mother. Not perfect, but devoted. She had worked double shifts when Thomas lost his job. She had held the family together when everything seemed to fall apart, but it hadn't been enough. When she opened her eyes, her gaze fell on an old envelope resting inside a photo album. The letter inside was one she had written years ago but never sent, a letter to Daniel. The ink had faded, but her words still carried the weight of her heart. "I don't know where you are, my boy, but I want you to know that I never stopped loving you. Not for a single day." Tears blurred the words as she read them again. Her heart ached, not just from loss, but from all the years wasted in silence. Margaret stood up slowly and walked toward the window. The reflection staring back at her was barely recognizable, silver hair pulled into a bun, lines etched deep into her skin, and eyes that carried too many yesterdays. The woman she once was, full of dreams and laughter, seemed like someone she used to know. The phone suddenly gave a faint click, just the house settling, but it was enough to make her turn sharply. For a brief second, her heart jumped, but the silence that followed crushed her again. She sat back down and whispered almost defiantly, "I'll wait another night." That had become her ritual, the promise she made to herself every evening. No matter how heavy her heart grew, she would wait, because waiting meant she still believed, and believing, no matter how painful, kept her alive. As midnight arrived, the clock chimed 12 dull notes. Margaret turned off the lamp, leaving only the dim glow of the streetlight spilling through the curtains. She leaned back, her gaze fixed once more on the phone. In the stillness, she thought she heard something, the soft echo of laughter, a child's voice calling, "Mum." Her eyes fluttered shut as she let the memory wash over her. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it the faint hum of the world that had moved on without her. But in that small house, time remained trapped. caught between memory and longing. It's between the life that was and the one that could have been. Margaret Hill, 60 years old, sat alone in the echo of her own silence. The phone never rang, yet she kept her vigil. Because somewhere deep inside, beyond the pain, beyond the years of quiet sorrow, she still carried a fragile, unbroken hope that one day the call would come. The morning light crept through the faded curtains, spilling across the small living room that still smelled faintly of last night's rain. Margaret Hill stirred awake in her chair, her neck stiff and her heart heavy with the same dull ache that had followed her for years. Another night had passed, another day had come, and still the phone remained silent. She rose slowly, brushing invisible dust off her cardigan, and shuffled toward the kitchen. Every movement was deliberate, as though the weight of time itself pressed against her bones. The kettle whistled weakly as she prepared her morning tea, the sound echoing through the emptiness. On the wall above the counter hung a framed quote, "Promises are meant to be kept." She stared at it for a long time, her lips curling into a sad, bitter smile. Thomas had gifted her that frame on their wedding anniversary decades ago. He'd said those words were the foundation of a marriage. She once believed him. As she sat down with her tea, a soft knock echoed through the quiet. Startled, Margaret set the cup down and walked to the door. Standing there was an elderly woman in a green coat, clutching an envelope. "Margaret, it's me, Ellen," the woman said with a faint, familiar smile. Margaret blinked. Ellen was her old neighbor, the one who'd moved away nearly 15 years ago. They had once shared long conversations over coffee and garden fences, but time and distance had washed that away. "I was visiting town," Ellen continued, stepping inside hesitantly. "I thought I'd stop by and give you this." She handed Margaret the envelope. The handwriting on the front made Margaret's heart jolt. It was Daniel's name, written in her late husband Thomas's sharp, unmistakable script. Margaret's hands trembled. Where did you find this?" Ellen sighed. "I was helping my niece clean out the old post office storage. Apparently, Thomas left it there, marked return to sender. Hold for pickup. It was never sent." The words sank into Margaret's chest like a stone. Her eyes burned as she clutched the envelope, unable to speak. Ellen placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "I didn't read it, of course. I just thought you should have it." When Ellen left, Margaret stood frozen for a long time before finally sitting by the window. Her fingers tore open the fragile paper, revealing a single yellowed sheet, a letter Thomas had written to their son. "Dear Daniel, if you're reading this, it means your mother and I couldn't find you. I need you to understand something. Your mother did what she thought was right. She never stopped loving you, not for a moment. Whatever you were told, whatever you think you saw, please don't blame her. The truth is more complicated than anger will ever allow. I'm sorry for everything. I wish I had been braver." Dad, tears slipped down Margaret's cheeks as her eyes moved over the words again and again. Whatever you were told. The phrase struck her like thunder. What had Daniel been told? Who had filled his young heart with such bitterness that he could turn his back on her so completely? She pressed the letter to her chest, rocking slightly. "Oh, Thomas, what did you do?" she whispered. The memories returned, arguments muffled behind closed doors, Thomas's secret phone calls, his unexplained absences. She had ignored them at the time, thinking it was just stress, money, or work. But now the puzzle pieces rearranged themselves into something far darker. She remembered the night Daniel left, the way he looked at her, eyes full of fury and betrayal, and shouted words she still heard in her dreams. "You never wanted me. You just wanted control." Those words hadn't come from a child's mind. Someone had planted them there. Her chest tightened as realization began to bloom. Had Thomas, the man she loved, the man she defended, poisoned her son against her, out of pride, out of guilt? She would never know for sure, but the thought was enough to make her fists clench. For 20 years she had blamed herself. She had carried the guilt like a cross, believing she'd driven her son away. But maybe she hadn't. Maybe she had been living inside someone else's lie. She rose from her chair and began searching through old boxes, determined to find anything, letters, photographs, documents, that might hold answers. The dust made her cough, but she kept digging. In a small box beneath old Christmas ornaments, she found something that made her freeze. An old cassette tape labeled Message 2004. She hadn't seen it before. Her hands shook as she placed it into her dusty tape recorder and pressed play. For a few seconds there was only static. Then a voice she hadn't heard in 20 years crackled through the speaker. Thomas's voice. Margaret, if you find this, it means I couldn't fix it. I made mistakes. Terrible ones. I thought I was protecting him, but I only broke everything. I lied to Daniel about you. I told him things no mother deserves to hear. I thought I was saving him from pain, but I was just saving myself from guilt. I'm sorry. The message cut off abruptly, leaving Margaret staring in stunned silence. Her breath came out in shallow bursts. Her knees gave way, and she sank to the floor. For years she had lived in grief. Now she felt something else rise from the ashes of her sorrow, rage, not wild or loud, but cold and sharp. Her husband had destroyed her family with lies. Her son had grown up hating her because of them. And now there was no one left to tell her story but her. Margaret wiped her tears with trembling hands and looked toward the phone again. The same phone that had been her prison now looked different, like a weapon. She whispered to herself, her voice steady for the first time in years, if the truth took 20 years to find me, I'll make sure it finds him too. And for the first time in a very long time, Margaret didn't just feel sadness. She felt purpose, and the weight of forgotten promises began to shift, turning into something new. The beginning of revenge. The following morning, the world outside Margaret's window seemed unusually bright, cruelly so. The sun touched every surface of her quiet home, exposing the dust, the loneliness, and the years of waiting she could no longer justify. But beneath the morning calm, something in her head shifted. The sadness that once weighed her down had hardened into resolve. For 20 years, she had lived believing she was forgotten. Now she knew she had been betrayed. Thomas's voice from the old cassette still echoed in her mind, his trembling confession, the guilt-laden words that changed everything. I lied to Daniel about you. Margaret sat at her kitchen table, the cassette lying beside her like evidence in a crime. For the first time in 2 decades, she felt a strange sense of clarity. The years of doubt and guilt had been a fog, and now that fog was finally lifting. She took a deep breath and picked up the phone. Her hands no longer trembled from weakness, but from a quiet, burning energy. She dialed the number of the private investigator, whose card she'd kept hidden in a drawer since Thomas's death. Mr. Lane Investigations, a man's voice answered. This is Margaret Hill, she said, her tone steady. I need to find someone. My son. His name is Daniel Hill. I haven't seen him in 20 years. There was a pause, followed by a polite assurance. Of course, Mrs. Hill. We can help with that. Do you have any last known address or contact? Margaret hesitated. All I have is a lie, she murmured bitterly. After she hung up, she sat in silence again, but this time the silence didn't suffocate her. It waited with her like an accomplice. Days passed. The investigator worked quickly, sending her updates. Margaret learned that Daniel was alive, successful, and living in another state, a polished man with a family, a home, and a life untouched by the shadows of his past. He worked as an architect, Mr. Lane told her, married, 2 children. Children, my grandchildren, she thought, her chest tightening. He had built a perfect world, one that didn't include her. That night she sat alone in the dim light of her living room, listening to the cassette again. She needed to hear it, not to torture herself, but to understand the man who had stolen her peace. Thomas's voice crackled faintly. I thought I was saving him from you. I didn't want him to see what I'd done. I didn't want him to know the truth about me. Margaret closed her eyes. What truth? What had Thomas done that was so unforgivable he had to destroy their family to hide it? As she pondered, another sound caught her attention. The faint hum of her old answering machine. She hadn't touched it in years. Dust covered the buttons, but she noticed the red light was blinking faintly. She pressed play. Message 1 and received December 31, 2004. Her heart thudded. That was the same year Daniel left. A voice came through, shaky and full of emotion. Mom, it's me. I don't know if you care, but I'm leaving. Dad said you wanted this, that you never wanted me here. I can't stay anymore. Don't try to find me." The recording ended abruptly. Margaret sat frozen. It was his voice, Daniel's teenage voice, confused, angry, heartbroken. Her hands covered her mouth as tears welled up. "Oh, Daniel," she whispered. The pain of hearing him again after so many years was unbearable. But underneath that pain, something new began to form, the need for truth. If Thomas had left one message, there might be others. She pressed the button again. Message 2 received April 2005. Thomas's voice filled the room. "Margaret, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to. I'll fix it. I'll bring him back." The message clicked off before it finished. Margaret's pulse quickened. There was something more. Something he had done. Something that had gone wrong. She leaned back in her chair, her breath unsteady. The man she had once loved had not only broken their family, but he had hidden something terrible behind his guilt. For the first time in years, she no longer saw herself as the victim. She saw herself as the last witness to a truth buried beneath 2 decades of lies. She opened her notebook and began to write. Every detail she remembered. The fights, the nights Thomas came home smelling of whiskey and secrets, the sudden changes in his temper, the cold way he spoke about Daniel near the end. Her handwriting was shaky, but her words were clear. This was her new purpose, to leave behind her side of the story. If she couldn't live long enough to see her son forgive her, she would at least make sure he knew the truth one day. A week later, Mr. Lane called again. "Mrs. Hill, we've found your son. He's in Seattle. I can provide his address and number if you're ready." Margaret's breath caught. Seattle. So far, yet finally real. "Yes," she said softly. "Please send it to me." When she received the details, she stared at the paper for a long time. The numbers seemed to blur as though they carried the weight of 2 lifetimes. She picked up her pen and wrote the number down beside the words. The truth must be told. She placed the cassette and the letter from Thomas into a small box, wrapping it neatly. It wasn't just a box. It was her weapon, her voice, her proof. Before she made the call, she looked around the house one last time. Every photo, every object, every memory had trapped her here for 20 years. But now it was time for her story to be heard. She picked up the phone and began to dial, slowly, deliberately, each number heavy with meaning. When the final digit rang out, she froze. The line connected. A soft male voice answered. "Hello." Her lips parted, but no words came. Her throat tightened. It was him, older, deeper, but unmistakably Daniel. Her eyes filled with tears. She wanted to speak, to tell him everything, but the years of silence had grown roots inside her. She couldn't force the words out. So instead, she hung up. The phone clicked back into stillness. Margaret sat there trembling, tears streaming down her face. "Soon," she whispered to the empty room. "Soon, you'll know everything." And as she pressed her hand against the box that held the truth, she realized that for the first time the silence wasn't her enemy anymore. It was her plan. The evening sky was painted in shades of dying orange, the kind of twilight that stretched shadows long across the earth. Margaret Hill sat at her dining table, her fingers tracing the edge of the small wooden box that now contained the truth. Thomas's confession tape, the unsent letter, and her own handwritten notes. The box looked innocent enough, but to her it was an instrument of justice. For 20 years she had been the woman who waited, patient, broken, forgotten. Now she was something else, a reckoning in slow motion. The room around her was dimly lit, her only companion the rhythmic ticking of the old clock. She had made up her mind tonight she would call Daniel again, but this time she wouldn't let silence win. Her trembling fingers dialed the number she had memorized days ago. The ringing began once, twice, 3 times, before a familiar voice answered. Hello. The sound of her son's voice, older now, steadier, sent a shiver down her spine. Her breath caught in her throat. Hello. Who is this? He repeated, a trace of impatience in his tone. Margaret pressed the receiver to her ear, her eyes closing. She could almost see him standing in some bright, modern kitchen, unaware that the ghost of his past was on the other end of the line. She hesitated, her voice cracking. It's your mother. A long silence followed. She could hear faint noises. the clatter of dishes, the sound of distant footsteps. Then came a voice she didn't recognize, a woman's, gentle and confused. "Daniel, who is it?" Daniel spoke again, but now his tone was different, cold, cautious. "I think you have the wrong number." The words hit her like a blade. "No," she said, her voice trembling. "It's not the wrong number. I know your voice. I've waited half my life to hear it again." "Look," he said, his voice rising slightly. "I don't know what kind of game this is, but—" "Daniel, please," she interrupted, tears spilling down her face. "I have something you need to hear. About your father. About what really happened." The silence that followed was heavier than before. She could hear his breathing, sharp, uncertain. Then, in a quieter tone, he said, "Don't ever call here again." The line went dead. Margaret's hand shook as she lowered the phone. The sound of the dial tone filled the room, harsh and unending. For a moment, she simply sat there numb. Then, slowly, her grief turned to anger. She stood, the chair scraping against the floor. "You can hang up, Daniel," she whispered through her tears. "But you can't hide from the truth forever." She took a deep breath, wiped her tears, and walked to the small recorder on her table. She pressed the red button and began to speak, her voice soft but steady. "Daniel, if you won't hear me now, you will one day. This is your mother. I'm leaving you the truth, everything your father hid from you. The lies, the letter, the recordings. He made you believe I didn't love you. But I did. I still do." Her voice broke, but she continued. "You were the best thing that ever happened to me. And no matter what he told you, I never gave up on you. I waited every day, every night for your call. And when it never came, I still hoped. But now I need to let go." When she finished, she sat back and stared at the recorder. It was all there. Her truth, her confession, her heart. She placed the cassette into the wooden box, closed the lid, and tied it with a faded ribbon. The next morning, she mailed the box to Daniel's office address. The envelope was plain, unmarked, except for a single handwritten note on the front, "When you're ready to know the truth." That evening, Margaret sat by the window, watching the world outside move with indifference. People walked their dogs, children played, and the faint hum of distant laughter drifted through the air. Life continued, even for those who no longer had a reason to wait. But Margaret no longer felt the emptiness she once did. She had finally spoken her truth, and in doing so, something within her had quieted. She made herself a cup of tea, sat down, and listened to the silence that had once tormented her. This time, it didn't feel cruel. It felt earned. As the night deepened, the phone rang suddenly. A sharp, startling sound that broke the calm. Her heart leaped. For a moment, she froze, staring at it. Then she slowly picked up the receiver. "Hello," she whispered. No one answered. She could hear breathing on the other end, quiet, shaky, hesitant, and then a familiar voice, faint but unmistakable, "Mom." Her eyes filled with tears. She tried to speak, but emotion choked her words. "Daniel." The line crackled and then went silent again. The call had ended as abruptly as it came. Margaret stood there, holding the receiver to her chest. The tears came freely now, not of pain, but of release. The call she had waited for all her life had finally come, even if only for a moment. Later that night, she sat on the porch, wrapped in her shawl, looking up at the stars. Somewhere out there, she knew her son was listening to the truth she had sent. Whether he forgave her or not didn't matter anymore. The weight was gone. For the first time in years, the silence felt gentle, not an enemy, but a companion. Margaret closed her eyes and smiled faintly. "The truth is its own kind of peace," she whispered. The wind rustled through the trees, and the phone inside her house began to ring again. But this time, Margaret didn't rush to answer. She simply listened, and let the sound wash over her like a lullaby. The morning light spilled softly into the small house, illuminating the quiet spaces that had long been haunted by shadows. Margaret Hill sat near the window, her shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders, the same spot where she had waited for years, for redemption, for forgiveness, for the call that never seemed to come. But today the air felt different. The silence wasn't heavy anymore. It was calm, like the pause before a final breath. On the table beside her rested the old rotary phone. the same one she had refused to replace for decades. Its cord was slightly frayed, its dial stiff from age, yet it still stood as a monument to her waiting, a symbol of love's endurance and pain's persistence. It had been 3 days since she mailed the box to Daniel, 3 days since that fleeting moment when his voice had whispered "Mom" over the phone before vanishing again into static. In those 3 days, she hadn't eaten much, hadn't slept much either, but her heart was lighter, freer, as though the truth she had carried for 2 decades had finally set her soul in motion again. Outside, the world was alive, birds sang, children played, and the neighborhood carried on. She watched it all with a quiet smile. For so long she had been invisible to life, a ghost trapped in memory. Now she felt like part of it again, even if only as a quiet observer. That afternoon the postman arrived. A small envelope slid through her mail slot and landed softly on the rug. Margaret's heart skipped. She shuffled forward, her knees aching, and picked it up. The return address made her breath hitch. Daniel Hill, Seattle. Her fingers trembled as she tore it open. Inside was a single sheet of paper with her son's handwriting, neat but uncertain. "Mom, I don't know what to say. I received your package. I listened to everything. I read Dad's letter. I don't know how to process it. All these years I thought you didn't want me, that you'd sent me away. Now I realize how wrong I was. I wish I could undo the years we lost, but I don't know how to face you. I'm not ready yet. Please understand. I needed you to know that I believe you, Daniel." Margaret pressed the letter to her heart, her tears falling silently. The words weren't forgiveness, not yet, but they were enough. After 20 years of silence, her son finally believed her. She whispered to the empty room, "That's all I ever wanted." She placed the letter beside her on the table, next to a photo of Daniel as a child, his smile wide, his eyes bright. "You came back to me," she said softly, "even if it took half a lifetime." That evening, the sky turned gray and gentle rain began to fall. Margaret brewed herself a cup of chamomile tea and sat back in her chair. She thought about the life she had lived, the joy, the mistakes, the heartbreak, and realized that even in its quiet tragedy, it had been hers. Every tear, every moment of waiting had led to this peace. The phone sat beside her silent, but for once she didn't stare at it with longing. She simply smiled at it as though it were an old friend. She thought of Thomas too. For years she had hated him for what he'd done. But now, with the clarity that comes from nearing the end, she found herself forgiving him. "You were weak," she murmured, "but I won't let your lies define me anymore." A soft knock startled her. When she opened the door, a young delivery boy stood there holding a small package. "For Mrs. Hill?" he asked. "Yes," she said, her voice quiet but steady. He handed it to her. A small parcel wrapped carefully, the sender's name again written in familiar handwriting, Daniel Hill. She took it inside, her hands trembling. Inside the box was a small framed photograph, her son, his wife, and 2 children standing in a sunlit garden. Tucked behind the photo was a note for you, Mom. I wanted you to see them. Your grandchildren. Maybe one day we can all meet. Until then, I hope this keeps you company. Her eyes blurred with tears. She touched the photograph gently, her fingers brushing against the faces she had never known but somehow already loved. A quiet laugh escaped her, soft, broken, but full of life. "They're beautiful," she whispered. She placed the photo on the mantel beside the others. For the first time in years, her family felt whole again, not through presence but through truth. Night descended gently. The rain had stopped, leaving behind a hush that felt almost sacred. Margaret sat once more by the window, her eyes growing heavy. The phone remained on the table beside her, and she rested her hand on it. "Thank you," she whispered, though she wasn't sure who she was thanking. God, fate, or perhaps the younger version of herself who had never stopped believing. As she drifted to sleep, the clock ticked softly in the background. Somewhere far away, a phone began to ring. Perhaps Daniel's this time, perhaps hers. In her dreams, she saw herself standing in a field of light, the sound of a distant phone call echoing through the wind. And then she heard his voice again, not from across a line, but beside her. "Mom?" he said. She turned and smiled, her heart finally still. The next morning, the house was silent once more. The tea on the table had gone cold. The phone remained off the hook, a faint tone buzzing softly through the air. On the wall hung the photograph Daniel had sent, a family reunited in spirit if not in body. The neighbors found her there peaceful, a faint smile on her lips, her hand still resting near the phone, as though she had finally answered the call she'd been waiting for all her life. And though the call that never came had defined her years, in the end, Margaret Hill had learned something greater sometimes. The most powerful calls aren't the ones we receive, but the ones we make to our own soul.